in 1981, something appeared in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. Something that would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only whispers, nightmares, and questions that still haunt us today. They called it Polybius. And if the stories are true, it was never meant to be a game at all. This is the story of an arcade cabinet that may have been a weapon, a psychological experiment disguised as entertainment, a ghost in the machine that left real scars on real people. Some say it's just an urban legend, a myth born from the paranoia of the Cold War era. But the people who played it? They'll tell you different if you can find them. Picture this. It's a Friday night in suburban Portland, 1981. The arcade is packed with teenagers, the air thick with cigarette smoke, and the electronic symphony of Pac-Man, Galaga, and Defender. Neon lights reflect off worn linoleum floors. The sound of quarters dropping into slots creates a rhythm all its own. This was the golden age of arcades. Every week brought new cabinets, new challenges, new ways to burn through your allowance. Kids knew every game by sight, every manufacturer's style. They could spot a Namco cabinet from across the room, recognize an Atari game by its attract mode. Then, without announcement or fanfare, a new cabinet appeared in the corner. Black, sleek, different. The cabinet bore no manufacturer's logo, no bright colors or cartoon characters screaming for attention, no Williams, no Midway, no Atari. Just a name etched in cold, clinical letters across the top. Polybius. The design itself was wrong. While other cabinets were adorned with vibrant artwork, aliens, spaceships, dragons, this one was minimalist to the point of being sterile. Some witnesses described subtle geometric patterns etched into the black surface, barely visible unless you caught them in the right light. Others claimed the cabinet seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The control panel was equally sparse. A single joystick, a few buttons, no instructions, no insert coin prompt in playful fonts. Just a screen that pulsed with a faint, hypnotic glow, even when no one was playing. Within hours, a crowd had formed. Kids lined up, quarters in hand, drawn to this strange new game like moths to a flame they couldn't see. There was something magnetic about it, something that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to curiosity, to that primal need to understand the unknown. And what they found inside that cabinet changed them. The gameplay was reportedly abstract. Geometric shapes pulsing and rotating, vector graphics that seemed to move in impossible ways. Players described tunnels that spiraled into infinity, fractal patterns that shifted and morphed, symbols that almost looked like letters, like words, but from no alphabet anyone recognized. The game had levels, but no one could quite explain what the objective was. Survive, solve, simply watch. Some players said they felt like they were being tested, but couldn't articulate what the test was measuring. Hand-eye coordination, pattern recognition, something deeper? The sounds were equally unsettling. Not the cheerful bleeps and bloops of Pac-Man, but low-frequency drones. Pulses that you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. Occasional high-pitched tones that seemed to bypass your ears entirely and drill straight into your skull. One player later described it as hypnotic. Another said it felt like falling into the screen. But it wasn't the gameplay that people remembered. It was what happened after. Within days, reports began to surface. Players experiencing violent nausea, debilitating headaches that lasted for hours, sometimes days, night terrors that felt more real than their waking lives. But these weren't isolated incidents. This wasn't one kid with a weak stomach or a pre-existing condition. This was a pattern. One teenager, a regular at the arcade known for his skill at Tempest and Defender, allegedly suffered a complete mental breakdown after a marathon session with Polybius. Witnesses said he played for over an hour straight, unmoving, barely blinking. When he finally stepped away from the machine, he was pale, sweating, trembling. That night, his screams woke the entire neighborhood. He was found in his bedroom, backed into a corner, screaming about shapes that followed him home. Shapes that were watching him. Shapes that knew things about him they shouldn't know. He was institutionalized within a week. Another player, a 13-year-old girl, stopped sleeping entirely. Her parents would find her night after night sitting upright in bed, staring at nothing, whispering about the patterns. When they asked what patterns she couldn't explain, or wouldn't, she would just shake her head and repeat, "They're everywhere now. I can see them everywhere." She began drawing them obsessively, notebooks filled with geometric designs, spirals, fractals. Her grades plummeted. She stopped eating. Her parents took her to doctors, therapists, neurologists. No one could find anything physically wrong with her. The symptoms were disturbingly consistent across multiple players. Seizures. Several players reported experiencing their first ever seizure within days of playing Polybius. The flashing lights, the pulsing patterns, epileptic triggers were well known even then, but these seizures were different. They came without warning, sometimes days after exposure, triggered by seemingly random stimuli. Amnesia. Players would lose chunks of time. They'd remember approaching the machine, inserting a quarter, and then nothing. They'd wake up hours later at home with no memory of leaving the arcade. Some had bruises they couldn't explain. Others found notes in their own handwriting that they didn't remember writing. Suicidal ideation. This was perhaps the darkest effect. Multiple players reported sudden, intrusive thoughts of self-harm. Not depression. They described it as something external, like thoughts that weren't their own being broadcast into their minds. One player said it felt like someone else's despair bleeding into my head. The game was doing something to them. But here's where it gets darker, where the story shifts from tragic malfunction to something far more sinister. Witnesses reported seeing men in black suits visiting the arcade after hours. Not to remove the machine, not yet, but to service it. They would arrive in unmarked vans, always after closing, always in pairs. They wore no identification, carried no toolboxes like normal arcade technicians. They would open the cabinet with keys the arcade owner didn't have, extract something from inside, circuit boards maybe, or data storage devices. They took notes, photographs. They measured things. Cold, clinical, methodical. The arcade owner, when questioned years later, claimed they told him they were from the company, but he couldn't remember which company. Couldn't produce any paperwork, couldn't even remember their faces clearly, which he admitted was strange because they came multiple times. One witness, a janitor working late, watched them from a storage closet. He said they worked in complete silence, no small talk, no radio chatter. They opened the machine, removed something that looked like a tape reel or early data storage device, replaced it with a fresh one, and left. They weren't fixing the machine. They weren't technicians. They were collecting data. According to the legend, Polybius was never a commercial product. It was never meant to make money. It was a government experiment, a psychological warfare prototype designed to test the limits of subliminal messaging, behavioral modification, and mind control. And the arcade was the perfect laboratory. The name itself is a clue, one that researchers have obsessed over for decades. Polybius was an ancient Greek historian who lived around 200 BCE. He wrote extensively about military tactics, political manipulation, and the psychology of warfare. His works explored how leaders could control populations through fear, propaganda, and strategic deception. Naming a mind control experiment after him, that's not coincidence. That's a signature. But to understand why the government might create something like Polybius, we need to go back further. Back to the darkest chapter of American intelligence operations, Project MKUltra. Declassified in the 1970s, MKUltra was the CIA's notorious mind control program that ran from 1953 to 1973. The project explored everything from LSD experiments on unwitting subjects to sensory deprivation, hypnosis, torture, and psychological manipulation. The goal was simple: find a way to control human consciousness, to break down the mind and rebuild it, to create programmable humans. The experiments were horrific. Prisoners, mental patients, and ordinary citizens were dosed with drugs without their knowledge. Some were subjected to weeks of sensory deprivation. Others were exposed to repeated electroshock therapy designed to erase memories and implant new ones. Many subjects were permanently damaged. Some died. And when the program was exposed, the CIA destroyed most of the records. Most, but not all. What survived revealed something chilling. MKUltra researchers were obsessed with finding delivery methods. How do you administer mind control on a mass scale? How do you test behavioral modification without subjects knowing they're being tested? Enter the arcade. Think about it. In 1981, arcades were everywhere. Millions of teenagers pumping quarters into machines, staring at screens for hours, completely absorbed. Anonymous, unsupervised, the perfect test population. And video games were new enough that no one understood their psychological effects. No studies, no regulations, no oversight. If you wanted to hide subliminal messages, flashing patterns designed to induce specific brain states, or test the effects of certain frequencies on human consciousness, a video game cabinet was the perfect Trojan horse. Some researchers point to specific technologies that were being developed in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Biofeedback systems, neurolinguistic programming, photic driving, the use of flickering lights to induce altered states of consciousness. All of these were being explored by military and intelligence agencies. What if Polybius was the field test? The men in suits collecting data weren't checking for mechanical problems. They were downloading results, player performance, reaction times, how long until symptoms manifested, which patterns were most effective, which frequencies produced the strongest effects. The arcade was the testing ground. Anonymous subjects, controlled environment, plausible deniability, kids pumping quarters into a machine that was pumping something far more sinister into them. And if things went wrong, if subjects had adverse reactions, well, they're just kids with overactive imaginations, teenagers prone to hysteria. Nothing to see here. The perfect crime is one where no one believes a crime occurred. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, Polybius was gone. No announcement, no explanation. The cabinet simply vanished one night, loaded into an unmarked van by those same men in black suits. Multiple witnesses reported seeing this happen, always late at night, always with the same clinical efficiency. The arcade owner, when questioned years later, claimed he had no records of the machine ever existing, no rental agreement, no contact information for the supposed company, no serial number, no paper trail whatsoever. He couldn't even remember how it arrived. One day it just wasn't there, and then it was. And then it wasn't again. It was as if Polybius had been erased from reality itself. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. Other arcade owners in the Portland area reported similar experiences. Cabinets appearing without documentation. Strange men servicing machines after hours. And then, within weeks, the cabinets vanishing. One owner kept a logbook of every machine in his arcade. When researchers examined it years later, there were gaps. Dates where the numbers didn't add up. Spaces where something should have been recorded, but wasn't. He couldn't explain it. Another owner found a photograph from 1981 showing his arcade floor. In the back corner, barely visible, was a black cabinet. He had no memory of it, couldn't identify it, but there it was, captured on film, proof that something had been there. The photograph has since disappeared, but the affected players, they remembered. Some still do decades later, their accounts eerily consistent despite having no contact with each other. The geometric patterns, the men in suits, the feeling that something had been taken from them, not just their quarters, not just their time, something deeper, something essential, One former player, now in his 50s, described it like this: "It's like there's a hole in my memory shaped like that game. I know I played it. I remember the feeling of playing it. But when I try to remember specifics, it's like trying to remember a dream. The harder I focus, the more it slips away. But the fear, that never fades." Several players reported long-term effects: chronic nightmares featuring geometric patterns, unexplained anxiety when exposed to certain visual stimuli. One woman claimed she couldn't watch certain types of screensavers or visualizers without feeling intense panic. And here's the most unsettling part. Some of them reported being visited. Years later, decades later, men in suits showing up at their doors, asking questions, taking notes, never identifying themselves, never explaining why. One former player refused to speak about Polybius for 30 years. When finally interviewed, he would only say, "They told me not to talk about it. They knew things about me, things I never told anyone. How did they know?" He died 6 months after that interview. Heart attack. He was 49 years old, no prior heart conditions. Coincidence? Maybe. So, what's the truth? Did Polybius really exist? The skeptics say no, and they have compelling arguments. They point to the complete lack of physical evidence. No ROM dumps, no circuit boards, no photographs that can be definitively verified. In an era when arcade collectors have preserved thousands of obscure games, how could Polybius leave no trace? They argue it's an urban legend, a creepypasta before the internet gave us the term, a story that grew in the telling, fed by Cold War paranoia and distrust of government. They point out that the earliest mentions of Polybius online date to the late 1990s, nearly 2 decades after it supposedly appeared. The website coinop.org listed Polybius in their database in 1998, but the entry was vague, possibly a hoax. The story gained traction on forums and conspiracy sites, each retelling adding new details, new witnesses, new layers to the mythology. But others aren't so sure. They point to similar experiments conducted during the Cold War, to the documented cases of subliminal messaging in media, to the fact that the government has admitted to conducting unethical psychological experiments on unwitting citizens. MKUltra wasn't a conspiracy theory, it was real, documented, admitted Operation Midnight Climax, where the CIA dosed unwitting citizens with LSD in brothels while filming them through two-way mirrors. Real. The Tuskegee syphilis study, where the government let black men suffer and die from untreated syphilis for 40 years. Real. The radiation experiments on pregnant women and disabled children. Real. So why is Polybius so hard to believe? In 2006, a man named Stephen Roach came forward claiming to be the creator of Polybius. He said it was just a normal game, a prototype that malfunctioned, causing the reported effects. He claimed the men in suits were simply repo men collecting a failed product, but his story had holes. He couldn't produce any documentation, no design documents, no code, no photographs. When pressed for details, his answers were vague, contradictory. He claimed the game was destroyed, all records lost, and then he vanished from public view shortly after coming forward. His website went dark. His email bounced. Researchers who tried to follow up found nothing. Convenient. Some believe Roach was a plant, a disinformation agent sent to muddy the waters. Others think he was a hoaxer seeking attention. A few believe he was telling the truth, but was silenced. We may never know. What we do know is this. Multiple witnesses, with no apparent connection to each other, have reported consistent details about Polybius over decades. The Black Cabinet, the abstract gameplay, the physical and psychological effects, the men in suits. Either they're all lying, all mistaken, all influenced by the same urban legend, or something happened in Portland in 1981 that someone very powerful wanted erased. Today, Polybius exists in the liminal space between myth and memory. It's been referenced in The Simpsons, where it appeared in the background of an arcade, labeled as a game that causes amnesia and seizures. Indie developers have created their own versions, trying to capture the legend. Researchers and conspiracy theorists continue to investigate, searching for that one piece of evidence that will prove it real. But perhaps the most unsettling part isn't whether Polybius existed. It's that something like it could have. Could still. In an era when our screens track our eyes, when algorithms know our thoughts before we do, when technology shapes our behavior in ways we barely understand. The line between game and experiment has never been thinner. Social media platforms run psychological experiments on millions of users without informed consent. Tech companies optimize for engagement, which is just another word for addiction. Governments and corporations collect data on every click, every pause, every micro-expression captured by your webcam. We're all playing Polybius now. We just call it something else. Maybe the arcade cabinet in Portland was real. Maybe it was the prototype for something much larger. Or maybe it's a warning, a story we tell ourselves about the dangers of surrendering our consciousness to machines we don't understand. Either way, the question remains, what else are we playing that's playing us back? Remember to like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Have you heard other versions of the Polybius story? Do you believe it was real? Let me know below. And maybe, just maybe, be careful what games you play in the dark, because somewhere, someone might be collecting data.